Welcome, everyone. Hello. Thanks a lot for joining on the call today. Today, we are going to focus on scalable strategies to ensure label compliance for CBD and cannabis product packaging. Webinar is being done by Artwork Flow and CLC regulatory partners together. So before I go any deeper into that, I will just quickly introduce ourselves. I'm Ankit. I am one of the co-founders of Artwork Flow. Artwork Flow is really the easiest way to manage label approval process and compliance for enterprise brands. And today on our panel, we have Orna with us. Orna brings deep experience in launching regulated products in full compliance with state and federal, international packaging and labeling laws. With her background in life sciences, pharmaceutical, and cannabis industries, Orna is really the go-to person for small multi-state cannabis and hemp product manufacturers. She's been at the forefront to make sure that we're able to reduce risk while really standing out in this competitive and complex marketplace. So Arnab, to just kick off the webinar, the first thing that I really wanted to ask you was we've heard a lot of people talk about it, and there is a difference between hemp and cannabis. So would you just take us through that and really kickstart the conversation from there?
Excellent. Yes, and thank you, Ankit. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that very kind introduction. Yeah, the difference between the plants, a very simple way is to say that they're the same species, but they have different genetics. So let's say a cannabis plant will produce a bud, and that bud will contain delta-9 THC, and of course that is the psychoactive ingredient. Those plants are regulated by the states. And so when we're talking about packaging and labeling laws, those are determined by the states. The difference with CBD is those buds come from a hemp plant. And so they will have CBD as well as other cannabinoids, but negligible amounts of THC. And because it's a different plant, it's regulated by the federal government. So that means the FDA, the FTC, Department of Agriculture are the ones setting the laws in the country for all the states to follow. That's not to say states don't have their own CBD laws, but we'll just keep it simple. What I want to point out is that it's really important that people understand that CBD is approved for topicals and oils, but according to the FDA, it is not an approved ingredient for foods or dietary supplements. And just today, there was a headline, and really the update is that nothing's changing. The FDA is, as I say, doubling down and reiterated the agency's position that CBD needs more research before it will consider it for food or supplements.
Very interesting one. So, Anna, when we look at FDA's sort of stand, or when we look at the differences between various state and the laws at the FDA level, what does compliance look like? Like, what should we think about when we think about compliance?
Well, that's a loaded question. So similar, cannabis and CBD products compliance goes into categories, and there we go. And so the laws, no matter what the products, food, supplements, cannabis, packaging and labeling laws exist to protect consumers. That's first, that's the intention. So how that gets implemented then in cannabis by the states then becomes just however they choose to do it, because it's state regulated. So let's give an example. Let's say the outer container security. That will apply to various consumer products. With cannabis in particular, though, most states will require child resistance. And in fact, that law points to a federal law that defines child resistance. But we can talk about tamper evident and say, well, some states do require that the outer package has a tamper evident seal and some don't. So, you know, each of these things, as I say, can be its own slide. And then, you know, what makes cannabis so complex is that each state then can have its own determination on how these are implemented. Again, they're similar, but different.
Got it. So are there any, mislabeling examples that you can really share with us, or any from your experience where you've seen people go wrong with the label and had to, had to face consequences because of that?
Yes. So just recently, this company put out a CBD product that in actuality contained THC. So of course the company had to recall the product, and it was very costly for them, and clearly, you know, was compromised at least one consumer who has chosen to sue the company over the mislabeling. And we call it mislabeling, but the fact is, you know, that's a big mistake. And that mistake happened someplace else in the organization. And so what's important to know is that, and as we'll get into, is that label is the result of a lot of inputs, and control needs to happen for all those inputs to be correct. So, you know, continuing on with mislabeling and inaccurate testing results. Just recently in Canada, a article was published in Canada, in the industry journal, Cannabis Industry Journal, that showed data over 3 years of product recalls in Canada. And over 70% of those were from mislabeling. And that's 140,000 products that were on the market that were mislabeled. And you can see a headline there, and there's just a screenshot from an actual mislabel where you can see the difference in the decimal point between the printed values and the actual values is significant.
Yeah, I think the difference looks like 20.50 and 205.0. Very, very significant as such.
Right. And of course, again, compromises patient safety, causes, you know, tremendous cost for the companies. And similarly in the US, the FDA did a study, and they looked at 147 CBD products. And in the end, they found that 50% were mislabeled. So they either had amounts of CBD more or less or none than the label said. And, you know, and I know this isn't the place to editorialize about the FDA and CBD. It is a very complicated situation, and clearly they, as they stated, they intend to continue to research the product before allowing it to have a claim that would, you know, in their minds, a claim would require a clinical study like a drug. And so it's a difficult place to be when you're a CBD manufacturer.
Got it. No, very interesting one. I think this slide shows us that the sample that FDA took, it almost the 50% of the products were mislabeled. I think we can quickly run a quick poll on our audience here to just check how many of them have actually had a labeling error or any of these in the past. If we can quickly run a poll, it will help us, understand the audience better and maybe, take it from there. So we have a poll running. We'll quickly take 10 to 15 seconds. If, all of you can just mark very, very quickly where if you've had recalls in the recent past, or if you've had any labeling errors, even if the product did not reach the market, but you were able to catch it earlier. But if you had any labeling errors in the past, would be really helpful to know. Okay, perfect. So we'll give it, I think, 10 more seconds and Then close the poll. Perfect. Yeah. So I think very, very similar results as what we would expect. 56% of the people in our audience actually had labeling error or faced these challenges in the past. So that shows how how the environment and how difficult it is to make sure that you're compliant. But as we will see more in the webinar and talk more about it, with process you can achieve that. But Anna, we've also seen that some of the, you mentioned earlier as well, that in US cannabis is regulated at the state level. So can you talk about a little bit about the challenges at the state and the FDA level, and how, like, how does at the federal level, how those challenges become a concern for manufacturers as well as labelers? Can you share a little bit more light on that?
Sure. So this slide here, is meant to convey the chaos that exists for packaging and labeling in the U.S., because each state does choose to create its own laws. Again, some may be similar, but for example, in the category of health warnings, there's probably, I won't say none, but it would be unusual to find two that say exactly the same thing. And I think there was a method to the madness. As you see here, states chose to create all new THC symbols. And really probably the reason for that is then it becomes easier for law enforcement to implement the laws of interstate transport between states that illegal. So, there's a lot that goes into the packaging and labeling from a state level. And so just to say that when you're a brand that wants to expand geographically, that becomes a real challenge, because you're creating your packaging and labeling for different markets. So that's where a big challenge comes in.
Any examples, Arnab, that you've come across of something which is acceptable in one state but not acceptable in the next, and any of those stories you can share with us?
Yeah, in fact, I think the next slide. These are examples very clearly. An edibles manufacturer wanting to create a flavor, wanting to put a picture of that flavor on the package. Well, in some states that's okay, but in others it's not. So, when you're designing for a product brand, keeping that consistent becomes a challenge. And I know we have a bunch of marketing and creative folks, and I know this is a very big challenge for them, keeping design consistent. The other example is, you see there a dispensary logo, and the state of Maine had objections to it. They felt that it was not adult enough and would attract minors. And so, the dispensary continues to use the logo, and the case is pending in court. But, these are things where, you really need to pay attention when you're designing your packaging to what each state specifically requires.
Got it. So, Anna, I think we looked at a lot of examples, and we also talked about what the impact of mislabeling can really be. But how should brands really become compliant? How do they ensure that they have label compliance? What would that process really look like in your mind?
So I think, what we can say here is that we're building a process for packaging and labeling, but at the same time, we're following this same just what you do for any other process with an organization. So there's a quality assurance mantra that I love, because it's so simple and so straightforward. Say what you do. So that is where, how do you do that? Well, you create documentation, SOPs, checklists that explain what it is you're doing. Do what you say. Well, who is doing it, and what and how are they doing that? and then be able to prove it, well, you need some kind of system to be able to prove it. So, those are kind of the elements. And again, these exist throughout an organization in various departments. And we can move on to the stakeholders, because I think one of the things about labeling cannabis products that makes it unique is that each stakeholder is responsible for bringing an input. But that input was created, in a process earlier. So for example, when we're talking about mislabeling and testing issues, that's kind of points to a problem in the manufacturing process, but will often show up in the labeling process. And as we've seen, sometimes doesn't even show up there. But to keep things under control, as long as everybody knows what they're responsible for, what their input is, because they're going to also need to be the ones to sign off on that input, to say that, the output of that. So that's the process, a high level view of what a process would be, from, a beginning function to creating something at the end, a label, for example, that would go to a printer. I hope that.
Yeah, no, that's like a really simple way to put it, right? Make sure that you say what you do what you say, and be able to prove it. And
Yeah.
you walked us through a really good example of who all the stakeholders are, as well as what a workflow could look like. But in the slide, you just mentioned in the slide before that the 3 stages probably are taking care of the stakeholders, making sure that you have a workflow, and then making sure that the documentation is right as well. So how important is the documentation process here, and what does that look like?
The documentation is critical, because that's where all your control is. So you control your documentation, you create your SOPs. Those are the documents that describe who does what, when, and the important thing about implementing a process is that people understand what it is, so that they know what their jobs are, what their responsibilities are, and those SOPs are really the source of training and creates the culture of compliance.
Got it. So I think just to make sure I can see a few questions popping up on the Q&A as well. In a few minutes, we would be done with the content as such. So both of us will be taking all of the questions. Just wanted to stop and make sure that we clarify that. But Anna, thanks a lot for walking us through the importance of the documentation as well. But you also mentioned that you need to have stakeholders, you need to have your workflow, you need to have the documentation. But a system becomes important to enable all of these and have a scalability built in to ensure compliance. So what would be the main sort of highlights of a scalable system which would enable you to remain compliant and actually add value to the enterprise who's really using that system?
Yeah, excellent, because really it comes down to control. And when you're talking about packaging and labeling specifically, for compliance, there are a few must-haves. So a first must-have is version control. An inspector can walk into a dispensary or manufacturer and point to a label and say, "Show me this artwork," and that should be readily available. If you can't get your hands on that current version of artwork, that points to a problem in the system. So that's mandatory. The other thing is an electronic signature within a system, because that's the accountability. We talked about the stakeholders providing the inputs as well as the signing off on the outputs. So that electronic signature is key, and that provides the audit trail. So again, for compliance, you want to be able to show an inspector, should you be asked, the evolution of a label. And so an audit trail that's within provided because it's within a system will show who did what, when did they do it. It might be why they did it, but those are the critical components, for compliance for a system. Um, those are the basics. There are other nice to haves, and I think your system really has a lot of those. So I think maybe it's probably most appropriate. I hand it over to you at this point, Ankit, and you can go through the features that make your system scalable. Because when we talk about scalable, it's what we're building here. You can build it for, it's like doing a party. You can do it for 6 people, or you can do it for 600. Same thing with labeling. Once you have that in place, it's expandable with the volume of labeling and the volume of employees.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Anna. I think you very well described the basics of what a system must have, because without it, creating and remaining compliant becomes really, really difficult. But some of the nice to haves, as you mentioned, labeling process includes stakeholders, includes a collaboration in itself to make sure that each one of the stakeholders is aware of what they have to do. But each one of the stakeholders is also able to do that task in the most efficient manner. That's where some of the features like annotation, proofing tools come into the picture. Like to be able to really just annotate on a label and say, okay, this is what I'm not seeing, or this is what I'm seeing when they're going through their checklist. Or being able to go into the proofing tools and figure out, okay, this is the font style that is used in this artwork, but may not be compliant with the state law, or this is the size of the font, or this is the Pantone shade, or compare, really just being able to compare 2 versions to see what really changed. Those aspects make that entire process of approval very efficient and seamless for all the stakeholders involved. While you mentioned in one of your stories as well that version controls become very important, but to be able to access the right version, to be able to access the asset when you need it, asset management also becomes very important, along with access control, to make sure that internally in your teams, you're able to find the right person, or you're able to find the right permissions to the right people, and they're able to in turn access any asset they need, which is out there in production, or a label which is out in the market at any given point of time. Right. And when we talk about scalable systems, there it can start from anywhere. Like you can have a basic system like Excel where you're just managing all of your projects. But it quickly becomes unscalable as you start managing multiple projects, multiple labels, and you start scaling up. From there, you can move to a system like a simple project management tool like Asana. A project management tool like Asana will give you the ability to have an audit trail, to be able to collaborate, to assign tasks to one another, and run a project. But that also, as you start scaling, and as you said, right, a party of 6 people or 600, when you start scaling from 6 labels to 600 to 6,000, a vanilla project management tool starts becoming difficult to manage. That's where very specific labeling softwares come into the picture, much like Artwork Flow, where they help you run your projects, proof them, go deep into them, annotate, audit trail, make sure that task is assigned to each one of them, and you're able to scale with the system like that. And that's what Artwork Flow as a system also does. Essentially, it helps all of the stakeholders come together, be able to annotate, collaborate on the labels, get the right label out at the right time with absolute accuracy. So yeah, I'll stop here and stop from our conversation and give it back to you to really just give a summary and takeaways of what we can take away from this webinar today. Over to you, Anna.
Sure, thank you. Well, first of all, I hope everyone that participated found something useful or heard something useful that they can put into practice. But I think that our messages are, packaging and labeling errors are not good. They can compromise consumer safety. They could be very costly. They brings a lot of risk. So any cannabis product manufacturer, really needs to know that control of that packaging and labeling is going to require certain tools and workflows and documentation that that make it all better. If that's, you need the control. And again, making the point, you absolutely need a packaging and labeling as well as in other parts of the organization. But and then for the same in terms of other parts of the organization, for artwork management, having a system specifically for that function is very efficient, if and certainly can help get to market faster and demonstrate compliance to inspectors. So, and I just want on one last note, because I didn't mention on when you finished with the system, the difference between must-haves and nice-to-haves is significant. And so, like and again, the point is scalable. You can do with a system for so long, but then at some point, in the cannabis world, you'll be overtaken by the volume of labels.
Thanks a lot, Anna. I think that was a good takeaway and a summary for all of us, including me here. But yeah, we'll quickly, we have another 10 to 15 minutes for questions, and we have quite a few questions on our radar. So we'll go through a few and try and answer them.
Okay.
I think Rich made a comment on one of our slides, and he mentioned that Curaleaf is in deep poo-poo for that. So I'm assuming it's one of the, when we were talking about, the labeling errors and some of the, problems that companies have faced, sure, Curaleaf is one of them. But Rich also had a question. What are the labeling requirements that are most common across states and industries? Is there a certain list of items that need to be checked? So Anna, if you can go ahead and answer that.
Sure. Well, I think the best place to start that answer is with the slide where we listed the various bullets of categories of what goes into a label. Because each cannabis label will have a symbol. It will have health warnings. There's always, the warnings will also always include pregnancy, breastfeeding, THC, it'll always include impairment. Edible warnings will include a period of time, but none of that is consistent. So for example, in some states, they'd say 2 hours for edibles to take effect. Some states say 4 hours. Some states don't say it. And so, the requirement to have that on the label even varies. So it's really hard to come to commonality across the US. That's what makes it so difficult.
Thank you, Anna. Rich also asked, will we be getting a copy of these slides? We'll definitely send a copy of the slides on after the webinar, Rich. We also have another question on appeal. Do you foresee challenges with scalability on labeling because of different unique identification requirements by state? For example, METRC issuing a unique number to a particular product versus BioTrack issuing a different unique identifier for the same product.
If I understand your question correctly, there are solutions when you're creating your labeling that allow you to create, let's say, a label on demand. So you can have your lab values on the same label with your branding. That those are technology things. There's a lot going on. There's so much product innovation, but there's also, because of that, there's so much packaging innovation. And so a lot of the packaging companies have come up with some pretty creative ways to get labeling on state compliant, things like booklet labels. So I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Question was anonymous, but if somebody asks the question and they want to speak up, be happy to just allow. If you can raise your hand, we can just allow you to speak as well. Perfect. So I think that's all the questions we had. We do have a couple of minutes. So if there are any, yeah, I think there's one more question for Anna. You mentioned in detail about the state-based guidelines. What would be the starting point for a company like ours looking to expand into 5+ states in terms of being compliant? So that's the question, Anna, from Tony.
So, right, you're stepping right into all the complexity of cannabis packaging and labeling when you want to create a brand, or you are creating a brand, expanding it into other states. You, when you know what those states are, I think the best maybe course to take is just to look at all the regulations on those states. And this is what we've done. We put them in a spreadsheet, and you try to find the commonalities in terms of design. And you won't find commonalities in THC symbols, because that's just by design again. So as all the manufacturers are looking for consistency, of course, in the states are looking to differentiate themselves. So it makes it challenging. But I would say that the less design, the better. I come from the pharmaceutical industry, where I watched labeling go from nice to really very plain. The FDA started really having opinions on how logos looked. They didn't want everything, they wanted everything plain and readable. That's what they so maybe the plainer the better, but of course that those are marketing challenges as well.
So in summary, if you're planning to launch in 5+ states, keep the design simple so that you don't run into a lot of these.
Yeah.
Perfect. So Kevin has another question. How close or far are we from federal regulations for cannabis packaging and labeling, in your opinion?
I don't even want to guess. I would have hoped we were further along with CBD. But again, this isn't the place to editorialize. And I just, there are a lot of forces that have to come together. Everyone has a stake in this, the DEA, the Department of Justice, everyone's got their opinions. And taking a drug that's been, removing it from a Schedule I status takes a lot of collaboration and agreement. So however long that takes.
Perfect. I think we did see, you mentioned one news today itself where they are going to do more trials and look at it more deeply. So I assume that means it is going to take more time.
Right.
Yeah, I think those were all the questions we had. Thank you everyone for joining. It was really, really good. Thanks, Anna, for being on the panel and really helping us understand the differences, and the various regulations and how to look at a scalable system. So thank you everyone. And we hope to really, really nice that all of you took time to join us today. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Okay. Bye.